Grant Mitchell, a 35-year-old seasoned police officer, was no stranger to danger. With over a decade of service under his belt, he had faced countless challenges in the line of duty. Yet nothing had prepared him for the emotional toll of losing his former partner years ago during a high-stakes operation. The memory still haunted him, leaving him with a constant, unshakable fear of loss. It was this void that Luca, his K9 partner, had filled, becoming not just a colleague, but a vital part of his life. Luca, a striking German shepherd with a black and tan coat and piercing amber eyes, had been by Grant's side for 6 years. From their first day together, it was clear their bond would be unlike any other. As Grant sat in his patrol car on a quiet city night, the glow of streetlights casting faint shadows on his face, he glanced over at Luca resting in the back seat. The dog's ears perked up at the faintest sound, always alert and ready to spring into action. For Grant, Luca wasn't just a partner. He was a lifeline, a guardian, and a friend who had pulled him out of situations that could have ended differently if not for the dog's instincts and courage. It wasn't just trust that tied them together. It was an unspoken understanding, a connection that ran deeper than words. Grant often marveled at Luca's intuition. The dog seemed to sense things before they happened. A subtle shift in body language, a faint smell in the air, or a sound too quiet for human ears. It was this remarkable skill that had saved Grant's life more than once. But beyond his sharp instincts and rigorous training, Luca's loyalty was what Grant valued most. Whether navigating high-risk situations or simply sharing a quiet moment after a long shift, Luca had a way of grounding Grant, reminding him of the importance of resilience and trust. The patrol that night was routine, but Grant had learned to never take peace for granted. He often used the quiet moments to reflect on the journey that had brought him and Luca together. He remembered the day he met Luca at the K9 Academy, a bright-eyed puppy with an energy that was almost uncontainable. Over the years, they had grown together, facing dangers that tested their limits and emerging stronger every time. They had become a team, a unit built on mutual respect and unwavering loyalty. As the car idled at a stoplight, Grant reached back and gently patted Luca's head. The dog looked up, his amber eyes meeting Grant's in a moment of silent acknowledgement. "Another night, huh, buddy?" Grant said with a faint smile. Luca's tail thumped softly against the seat in response, his way of reassuring Grant that he was ready for whatever the night might bring. Little did they know, this night would push their bond and resilience to the limit, forever changing the course of their journey together. The quiet hum of the city had always been a backdrop to Grant Mitchell's nightly patrols. The familiar rhythm of distant traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, and the soft buzz of the radio were all sounds he'd grown accustomed to during his years on the force. Beside him in the patrol car, Luca, his loyal K9 partner, sat alert, his amber eyes scanning the dimly lit streets as if he could sense something in the air. Grant often joked that Luca had a sixth sense for trouble, but deep down, he knew it was no joke. The bond they shared wasn't just forged in trust. It was built on countless missions, each one sharpening their instincts and deepening their connection. That night, however, would test their partnership like never before. Grant had just taken a sip of lukewarm coffee when the radio crackled to life, its sharp voice breaking the stillness. "All units reported robbery in progress at Capitol Street Bank. Suspects may be armed. Proceed with caution." Grant felt his pulse quicken as adrenaline surged through him. His hand instinctively reached for the radio. "Unit 15 responding," he said firmly. He glanced at Luca, who was already on high alert, his body tense, ears pricked forward. "Looks like it's time, buddy," Grant murmured, his voice steady but tinged with an edge of anticipation. Luca let out a low, approving bark, as if he understood the gravity of what lay ahead. As they approached the scene, the air felt heavier. charged with an almost palpable tension. The usually bustling commercial street was eerily silent, the surrounding shops cloaked in darkness. The bank loomed ahead, its windows reflecting the dim glow of distant streetlights. Grant parked the car a safe distance away and took a moment to assess the situation. "Stay close," he whispered to Luca as he unhooked the leash. The German shepherd stepped out of the car, his movements calculated and precise, his tail stiff, a clear sign he was ready for whatever came next. Grant's sharp eyes scanned the area, but it was Luca who first picked up on the subtle movements in the shadows near the side of the building. The dog let out a low growl, his body lowering into a crouch. Grant felt his muscles tighten. He trusted Luca's instincts implicitly. "You see something?" he muttered, gripping his flashlight in one hand. As they advanced, the faint sound of hushed voices and the metallic clang of a crowbar echoed from the alley behind the bank. Luca's growl deepened, a sound Grant had come to associate with imminent danger. Suddenly, chaos erupted. A loud noise shattered the silence, sending Grant diving for cover. His heart pounded as he tried to process the scene unfolding before him. A figure emerged from the shadows, their hands gripping an object tightly, and Luca didn't hesitate. The dog launched himself forward with unparalleled precision, a blur of black and tan against the dim backdrop. "Luca, no!" Grant shouted, his voice breaking as concern gripped him. But Luca was already in action, intercepting the individual before they could make another move. In the chaos, Grant barely had time to react when another figure appeared. A loud crack pierced the night, followed by a sound that would haunt Grant forever. A sharp, pained yelp. He turned, his stomach dropping as he saw Luca collapse onto the cold pavement. "Luca!" Grant shouted, his voice raw with panic. The sight of his partner lying motionless sent a surge of desperation through him. Fueled by urgency, Grant neutralized the threat before rushing to Luca's side. He pressed his hands against Luca's wound in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. "You're gonna be okay," Grant choked out, his voice trembling. Tears blurred his vision as Luca's eyes met his, faint, flickering, but still filled with trust. Backup arrived moments later, but for Grant, time had slowed to a crawl. Nothing else mattered but the life of the partner who had just risked everything for him. Grant's hands trembled as he cradled Luca's limp body in his arms, the world around him a blur of flashing lights and chaotic voices. The chaos of the robbery had subsided, but the true battle was just beginning. Blood soaked through Grant's uniform as he pressed a hand to Luca's wound, trying desperately to staunch the bleeding. "Stay with me, Luca," he whispered, his voice cracking with fear and urgency. Luca's amber eyes, once sharp and full of life, now flickered weakly, as though fighting to stay open. The sight broke something deep inside Grant, but he refused to let despair take hold. "You're stronger than this. You've always been stronger." Ignoring the shouts of officers securing the scene, Grant carried Luca to his patrol car, his own adrenaline masking the weight of his exhaustion. The sirens around him blurred into a haunting symphony as he sped toward the emergency veterinary hospital. Every second felt like an eternity as the gravity of the situation pressed on him. The road ahead was dark and winding, but Grant's focus was unshakable. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he glanced at Luca in the rearview mirror, the dog's breaths shallow but steady. "You've saved me so many times," Grant said, his voice a mix of desperation and determination. "Now it's my turn to save you." When they arrived at the hospital, Grant barely noticed the veterinary team rushing toward the car. The lead veterinarian, Dr. Jessica Smith, took one look at Luca's condition and immediately issued orders to her team. "We'll do everything we can," she assured Grant, her voice calm yet urgent. But the weight of her words, "he's critical," hung heavy in the air. Grant nodded, his throat tight, unable to speak. All he could do was watch as Luca was wheeled away, leaving him standing alone in the sterile hallway, blood staining his hands. The hours that followed were a blur of pacing, clenched fists, and silent prayers. The waiting room, with its cold, fluorescent lights, felt suffocating. Grant replayed the scene over and over in his mind. Luca lunging to protect him, the gunshot, the way his partner had collapsed. The memory cut deep, filling him with equal parts guilt and admiration. "You didn't hesitate," Grant whispered to himself, tears welling in his eyes. "You never do." Jessica returned hours later, her face lined with exhaustion, but carrying a glimmer of hope. "He's stable for now," she said. "The next 24 hours will be critical, but he's a fighter." Grant exhaled shakily, relief and fear colliding in his chest. "Can I see him?" he asked. Jessica hesitated, then nodded. When Grant entered the recovery room, the sight of Luca hooked up to machines nearly broke him. Kneeling beside the stretcher, he gently rested a hand on Luca's head. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We've been through too much for you to give up now. Fight for me, just like you always do." The sterile waiting room of the veterinary hospital had grown eerily quiet as the hours dragged on. Grant Mitchell sat slumped in a stiff plastic chair, his elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly together as if holding himself together by sheer will. Luca's faint, labored breaths and the rhythmic beeping of the machines from the recovery room still echoed in his mind. Exhaustion gnawed at his body, but his heart wouldn't let him rest. His partner, his family, was fighting for his life, and the weight of helplessness felt unbearable. It was nearly midnight when the sound of the hospital doors opening pulled Grant out of his daze. He looked up to see Christopher, the rookie officer who had always admired Luca, walking in with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Christopher had a nervous but hopeful smile as he approached. "Figured you could use this," he said, holding 1 cup out to Grant. Grant accepted the coffee with a nod but didn't drink it. His thoughts were still tangled in guilt and worry. "He's stable, but it's touch and go," Grant muttered, his voice barely audible. "They said the next 24 hours are critical." Christopher sat down beside him, his expression somber but resolute. "Luca's the toughest dog I've ever seen," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "You remember the time he found those kids lost in the snow? Or the drug bust where he sniffed out a stash no one else could find? He's got more fight in him than any of us." Grant managed a faint smile, but his eyes remained distant. "He's more than a partner, Chris. He's everything. I don't know how to do this without him." Christopher placed a hand on Grant's shoulder. "You don't have to," he said firmly. "You've got all of us. The precinct's behind you, Grant. Everyone's rooting for Luca." As if on cue, the hospital doors opened again, and a group of Grant's fellow officers entered, their faces etched with concern. They each approached Grant, some offering quiet words of encouragement, others sharing stories of Luca's heroism. It was clear that Luca wasn't just Grant's partner. He was a part of their team, a symbol of bravery and loyalty that everyone admired. Even the precinct's captain, a man known for his stoic demeanor, called to check in. His voice, usually commanding, softened as he said, "Take your time, Mitchell. We've got your back. Luca's part of our family, too." The overwhelming support began to chip away at the walls of isolation Grant had built around himself. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to hope. These people, his team, were here not just for him, but for Luca, too. It reminded him that he wasn't alone in this fight. Inside the recovery room, Luca continued to hold on, his breathing steady but fragile. Grant was allowed brief visits with him, during which he would sit by the German shepherd's side, whispering words of encouragement. He recounted their adventures, reminding Luca of all they had accomplished together. "You've saved lives, buddy," Grant said softly, his hand gently stroking Luca's head. "You're not done yet. We've still got so much to do." The hospital staff, led by Jessica Smith, also became an integral part of the battle. They worked tirelessly, not only to tend to Luca's injuries, but to support Grant as well. Jessica often stopped by the waiting room to give updates, her calm professionalism balanced by a genuine empathy. "Luca's a fighter," she said during one of her visits. "But dogs like him fight even harder when they know their people are here. Keep talking to him. He knows you're with him." As dawn approached, the waiting room no longer felt so desolate. Officers came and went, bringing stories, photos, and even small gestures of humor to lighten the heavy atmosphere. One officer had brought in an old framed photo of Grant and Luca from their first day on the job together. The sight of it brought tears to Grant's eyes, a mix of nostalgia and determination swelling in his chest. By the time the first rays of sunlight spilled through the hospital windows, Grant felt something he hadn't felt in hours: hope. The combined strength of the community, the expertise of the veterinary team, and the unyielding spirit of his partner gave him the courage to believe. He stood outside the recovery room, looking at Luca through the glass, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "We're all here for you, buddy. You've always been the strong one. Now it's my turn." In that moment, Grant understood that this fight wasn't just his alone. It was shared by everyone who believed in Luca, who saw the hero in him. It wasn't just about recovery, it was about resilience, loyalty, and the bonds that held them together, even in the darkest of hours. The first rays of dawn filtered through the hospital windows, painting the walls with a soft golden hue. After hours of pacing, whispers, and anxious waiting, Grant Mitchell stood motionless outside Luca's recovery room. The sight of his partner lying so still on the stretcher, tubes and monitors attached to his once powerful body, felt like a knife twisting in Grant's chest. He placed a hand on the glass, as if trying to bridge the gap between them. "You fought so hard, Luca," he whispered to himself. "Don't give up now." It had been a night of agony and endurance, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. Jessica Smith, the lead veterinarian, had reassured him hours earlier that Luca's condition had stabilized, yet her words of caution still echoed in his mind. "The next few days will be crucial. He's not out of the woods yet." Those words lingered like a shadow, reminding Grant that the battle was far from over. Determined not to let his fears overwhelm him, Grant pushed open the recovery room door. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the soft beeping of machines that marked Luca's fragile lifeline. Grant approached his partner's side, his boots barely making a sound on the polished floor. He knelt beside Luca, his hand trembling as it rested gently on the dog's head. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, his voice cracking. "It's me. I'm right here." Luca's ears twitched faintly at the sound of Grant's voice, a small but significant sign of recognition. Grant's breath caught in his throat, and a shaky smile broke through the exhaustion etched into his face. "That's it," he whispered, his tone filled with a mix of relief and determination. "You're still in there. We're going to get through this. Together." The hours stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Grant refused to leave Luca's side, despite the encouragement of Jessica and the veterinary staff. He sat in a chair pulled close to the stretcher, his hand never straying far from Luca's paw. The room was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of staff members and the rhythmic hum of medical equipment. Grant spoke to Luca in hushed tones, recounting their past missions, their victories, and the lives they had saved together. "You remember that snowstorm a few years back?" Grant said with a faint chuckle, his fingers gently scratching behind Luca's ears. "We spent hours out there, searching for those kids. You were the one who found them, buried under all that snow. You didn't even hesitate." His voice softened, and he leaned closer. You've always been the strong one, Luca. Now it's my turn to be strong for you. Each small sign of progress felt monumental. By mid-afternoon, Luca's breathing had become steadier, and his tail twitched faintly whenever Grant spoke. Jessica stopped by frequently, her expression a mix of exhaustion and optimism. "He's responding well to the treatment," she said during one visit. "Keep doing what you're doing, Grant. He knows you're here, and that makes all the difference." As the day wore on, Grant's colleagues continued to check in, offering words of encouragement and updates from the precinct. Christopher stopped by with a framed photo of Grant and Luca from their first K-9 certification ceremony. "I thought this might help," he said, placing the photo on a nearby table. Grant stared at the image, his chest tightening with emotion. "Thanks, Chris," he said quietly. "It means a lot." By evening, Grant decided to try something new. He had brought Luca's favorite toy, a worn, battered rubber ball from the car. Holding it up, he knelt beside the stretcher. "Remember this?" he asked, his voice gentle. Luca's eyes flickered open briefly, his gaze locking onto the ball. His paw twitched, as if trying to reach for it, and Grant's heart swelled with hope. "That's my boy," he said, a small smile breaking through the fatigue. "One step at a time." Jessica watched from the doorway, her arms crossed and a rare smile on her face. "You two are quite the team," she said softly. "He's fighting because he knows you're here." That night, as Grant sat beside Luca, the dog's breathing slow but steady, he allowed himself to believe they could win this fight. "You've always been my hero, Luca," he whispered, resting his hand gently on the dog's head. "And I'm not giving up on you." For the first time since the shooting, the weight of despair began to lift, replaced by the fragile but growing light of hope. The days that followed were a testament to resilience, not just for Luca, but for Grant as well. Every moment in the recovery room became a delicate balance between hope and uncertainty. Luca, once the epitome of strength and agility, now struggled with the most basic movements. His wounds were healing, but the road to recovery stretched far beyond the physical. For Grant, watching his partner fight to regain even the smallest part of his former self was both inspiring and heartbreaking. The veterinary team, led by Jessica Smith, had devised a meticulous plan for Luca's rehabilitation. It began with small steps, literally and figuratively. On the first day of physical therapy, Grant stood beside Luca as two technicians gently supported the German Shepherd's body, encouraging him to stand. The effort was monumental. Luca's legs trembled violently under his weight, and after just a few seconds, he collapsed onto the padded mat. Grant knelt beside him immediately, stroking his fur. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "We'll try again tomorrow." But Luca's spirit was unyielding. Each day brought incremental progress, an extra second on his feet, a small but determined step forward. Grant was there for every moment, offering quiet encouragement and unwavering support. He could see the fight in Luca's amber eyes, the same determination that had saved countless lives on the field. "You've got this, Luca," Grant would say, his hand always resting reassuringly on the dog's head. "We're in this together." One afternoon, as Luca lay resting after a particularly exhausting session, Christopher stopped by the hospital. This time, he brought not just coffee, but a small framed photo of Luca standing tall and proud during a training session years ago. His coat gleamed in the sunlight, his stance confident and strong. "I thought this might remind him of who he is," Christopher said, placing the photo on the table beside Luca's stretcher. Grant stared at the image, a bittersweet smile forming on his lips. "Thanks, Chris," he said quietly. "He'll get back there. I know he will." The turning point came a week later. The veterinary team had set up a small enclosed area outside the hospital where Luca could experience fresh air and grass under his paws again. It was a crisp morning, the kind that carried a hint of renewal in the air. Grant gently lifted Luca from the stretcher and carried him outside, his movements careful and deliberate. He placed Luca on a soft blanket under the shade of a tree. "Do you remember this, buddy?" Grant asked softly. "All those days at the park, training and running drills? We'll get back there." I promise. Luca sniffed the air, his nose twitching as if the familiar sense awakened something deep within him. Slowly, with Grant's encouragement, he pushed himself onto his feet. His legs wobbled, and for a moment, it seemed like he might collapse again. But then, against all odds, Luca stood tall, his body shaking but upright. He held the position for 10 seconds, 10 of the most heart-stopping seconds Grant had ever experienced, before easing himself back down onto the blanket. Tears filled Grant's eyes as he clapped softly, his voice filled with pride. "That's my boy," he said, his heart swelling. "You're incredible." From that day forward, Luca's recovery gained momentum. The veterinary team introduced more exercises, and Grant was there every step of the way, guiding and supporting his partner. Each milestone, no matter how small, felt monumental. The first time Luca walked unaided across the yard, Grant laughed through his tears, his voice shaking with emotion. "You're doing it, Luca. You're really doing it." As the days turned into weeks, Luca's strength grew steadily. His coat regained its shine, his movements became more fluid, and his amber eyes sparkled with renewed purpose. The bond between Grant and Luca deepened in ways neither of them could have imagined. They had always been a team, but this journey had forged an unbreakable connection. A partnership built not just on trust, but on shared perseverance. One evening, as the sun set over the hospital grounds, Grant sat beside Luca, a rubber ball resting between them. The battered toy had been Luca's favorite for years, a symbol of their shared adventures. Grant rolled it toward him, and for the first time since the shooting, Luca nudged it back with his paw. The simple gesture brought a smile to Grant's face, a reminder of how far they had come. "You've always been a fighter," Grant said softly, resting a hand on Luca's head. "And now you've shown me what it really means to never give up." Luca let out a soft huff, his tail wagging gently. In that moment, under the fading light of the day, Grant knew that they weren't just recovering. They were rebuilding. Together, they were stronger than ever, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. It had been weeks since the harrowing night that had nearly taken Luca's life. The German Shepherd's recovery had been nothing short of remarkable, a testament to his unyielding spirit and the unwavering support of Grant Mitchell, his handler. Each day, Luca grew stronger, his steps steadier, his energy returning. Yet despite the progress, Grant couldn't shake the lingering doubt in his mind. Was Luca ready to return to duty? Could he handle the physical and emotional demands of the field again? Those questions found their answer on a brisk autumn morning, when Grant's phone buzzed with an urgent call from his precinct. Captain Avery's voice came through the line, tense but measured. "Grant, we've got a situation. A young boy, 7 years old, has gone missing near the state park. It's been over 5 hours, and the search teams haven't found anything. We need Luca. You're the best shot we've got." Grant's heart raced. The state park was vast, with dense woods, rocky terrain, and frigid temperatures, a daunting environment for even the most seasoned search teams. He glanced at Luca, who stood by the door, his tail wagging faintly as if sensing the urgency in Grant's expression. Luca had been training hard, slowly regaining his strength and confidence, but this would be his first real mission since the shooting. Grant hesitated for a moment, then knelt beside his partner. "What do you think, buddy?" he asked, resting a hand on Luca's head. The dog looked up at him, his amber eyes filled with trust and determination. That was all the answer Grant needed. "Let's bring that boy home." When they arrived at the state park, the scene was chaotic. Officers, park rangers, and volunteers were scattered across the area, coordinating search efforts. The boy's parents stood nearby, their faces pale with worry. Grant approached them, his voice calm but firm. "We'll find him," he promised, glancing down at Luca, who was already sniffing the air, his body tense and ready. Grant held out a small piece of the boy's clothing, letting Luca take in the scent. "Find him, Luca," he commanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Luca's ears perked up, and without hesitation, he bolted forward, his nose to the ground. Grant followed closely, weaving through the dense underbrush as Luca led the way. The search was grueling. Hours passed as Luca tracked the boy's scent, navigating steep hills and thick tangles of trees. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Grant's radio crackled with updates from other teams, but none had found any sign of the boy. Doubt began to creep into Grant's mind. Had he pushed Luca too soon? Was his partner truly ready for this? But Luca showed no signs of stopping. His tail wagged as he veered sharply to the right, his nose glued to the ground. Grant's heart surged with renewed hope. "You've got something, don't you, boy?" he said, his voice breathless but hopeful. Suddenly, Luca stopped in a small clearing, barking sharply and urgently. Grant pushed through the bushes and saw the boy curled up against a tree, shivering but alive. Relief washed over him as he dropped to his knees beside the child, quickly checking his pulse and breathing. "You're okay," Grant said softly, wrapping his jacket around the boy's small frame. The child's eyes fluttered open, filled with tears. "I was so scared," he whispered. Grant smiled, his voice steady. "You're safe now. Luca found you." The boy's gaze shifted to Luca, who stood nearby, his tail wagging as he watched over them. The child reached out a trembling hand, and Luca leaned in, nuzzling it gently. The boy's face lit up with a small, tearful smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. By the time they returned to the search command center, cheers erupted as the boy was reunited with his family. Officers and volunteers gathered around Luca, praising him for his incredible work. Grant knelt beside his partner, his hand resting on Luca's head. "You did it, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew you could." That evening, back at home, Grant and Luca sat together on the porch. The stars above twinkled softly, and the cool autumn air carried a sense of peace. Grant looked down at Luca, who rested his head on Grant's lap, his body relaxed but his eyes still alert. "You proved something today, Luca," Grant said quietly, scratching behind his ears. "You're not just back. You're better than ever. You reminded me why we do this, why we fight. You're my hero, and you always will be." Luca let out a contented sigh, his tail thumping softly against the wooden porch. In that moment, under the vast expanse of the night sky, Grant knew that their bond had only grown stronger through the trials they had faced. Together, they had overcome the unthinkable, and together, they would continue to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Weeks after Luca's triumphant return to duty, the precinct decided it was time to honor the dog who had defied the odds and inspired everyone around him. The ceremony was meant to be a celebration, not just of Luca's bravery, but of the bond he shared with Grant Mitchell, a bond that had carried them through darkness and brought them back stronger. As the day approached, Grant couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and apprehension. Would Luca handle the crowd? Would the attention overwhelm him? But as he brushed Luca's coat that morning, he saw the same determined spark in his partner's amber eyes. "You're ready for this, buddy," he said softly, securing Luca's harness and attaching his canine badge. "Let's show them what you're made of." The precinct courtyard was bustling with life when they arrived. Officers, families, and members of the community had gathered, their faces lit with admiration and gratitude. A large banner stretched across the stage, reading, honoring Luca, a true hero. Grant felt a lump rise in his throat as he looked around, spotting familiar faces among the crowd. Even the family of the boy Luca had rescued was there, their expressions filled with emotion. As Grant and Luca approached the stage, a wave of applause erupted. Luca's ears perked up at the sound, and his tail wagged faintly. Grant knelt beside him, whispering, "This is all for you, pal. You earned it." Together, they climbed the steps, standing before the crowd that had gathered to celebrate their journey. Captain Avery stepped forward, his voice carrying over the noise. "Today, we honor not just a K-9 officer, but a symbol of resilience, loyalty, and unwavering courage," he said, gesturing toward Luca. "This dog has shown us what it truly means to fight through adversity and come out stronger. He's more than a partner. He's a hero." The captain turned to Grant, handing him a medal engraved with Luca's name. Grant knelt, placing the medal gently around Luca's neck. The crowd erupted into cheers, some officers wiping tears from their eyes as they watched the once critically injured dog stand tall once more. Grant leaned close to Luca, his voice barely audible over the applause. "You did it, buddy. You've always been my hero, and now everyone knows it." When the applause died down, Grant stepped forward to address the crowd. His voice, steady but filled with emotion, echoed across the courtyard. "Luca isn't just my partner, he's my family. He's saved lives, brought hope, and reminded me every day what it means to never give up. This medal is just a small reflection of the incredible work he's done and the impact he's had on all of us. Thank you for recognizing him today." After the ceremony, families and children lined up to meet Luca. Some approached cautiously, but Luca, ever patient, greeted each person with a gentle nuzzle or a wag of his tail. The boy he had rescued ran up and hugged him tightly, whispering, "You saved me." "Thank you." Grant's chest tightened as he watched, tears welling up as he saw the profound impact Luca had on those around him. That evening, back home on their porch, the medal gleamed softly in the fading sunlight. Luca lay at Grant's feet, his head resting on his handler's lap. The quiet serenity of the moment was a stark contrast to the chaos they had endured weeks earlier. Grant stroked Luca's fur, his voice a soft murmur. "You remind people every day what it means to be brave, Luca. You're more than a hero. You're a reminder that no matter how hard it gets, there's always a reason to keep fighting." Luca let out a contented sigh, his tail thumping lightly against the wooden boards. In that moment, Grant knew their journey had only just begun. Together, they would continue to inspire and protect, proving that resilience, loyalty, and love could overcome even the darkest challenges. As the final rays of sunlight faded and the stars began to dot the evening sky, Grant Mitchell sat quietly on his porch, his loyal K-9 partner Luca resting at his side. The cool breeze carried the sounds of crickets chirping, a peaceful contrast to the chaos they had endured just weeks before. Grant gently stroked Luca's fur, his hand moving rhythmically as he gazed at the horizon. The medal gleaming softly around Luca's neck was more than an award. It was a symbol of their shared journey, a testament to the power of resilience, love, and unyielding loyalty. In the stillness of the night, Grant reflected on how far they had come. From the life-threatening injury that had nearly taken Luca away to the grueling days of recovery, every moment had been a lesson in perseverance. Luca had shown him that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the strength to fight back could be found in the bonds we hold dear. The German Shepherd had not only saved lives on the field, but also reminded everyone who knew his story that hope and courage could shine even in the darkest times. "You've changed so much, buddy," Grant said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "Not just my life, but the lives of everyone you've touched. You've shown the world what it means to never give up." Luca let out a contented sigh, his amber eyes glowing with trust and peace. Their story wasn't just about survival, it was about the profound connection between man and dog, the strength found in loyalty, and the hope that emerges from persistence. As they sat together under the stars, Grant knew that their journey was far from over, but whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, stronger than ever.